Hi, you're a bag of neurons. About 86 billion of them, give or take, all firing electrical signals so you can feel things like joy, anger, and that weird guilt you get after eating an entire sleeve of Oreos at 2 a.m. But here's the thing, nobody actually agrees on what emotions are, where they come from, or why you have them. So let's fix that. The wiring beneath. You've probably heard that the amygdala is the emotion center of the brain. It's the little almond-shaped thing deep in your temporal lobe that supposedly runs the whole show. Fear, amygdala. Anger, amygdala. That panic when your phone hits 1%, amygdala. Yeah, that's not how it works. Emotions don't live in one spot. They run through a distributed network of brain regions all firing at the same time. We're talking the thalamus, the amygdala. Yes, it's involved, it's just not the boss. The insula, the ventral striatum, the medial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and the anterior cingulate. That's at least 8 major regions working together every time you feel something. A meta-analysis of 55 neuroimaging studies looked at 761 activation peaks across all kinds of emotional tasks, and the closest thing they found to a general hub was the medial prefrontal cortex, not the amygdala, and even the medial prefrontal cortex isn't running the show solo. It's more like the project manager who sends a lot of emails but still needs the whole team to get anything done. But here's the wildest part. Some emotional signals don't even bother with most of the brain. Your olfactory system, the one that processes smell, can send affective signals to limbic structures through as few as 2 synapses. 2. That's one of the fastest routes in your entire nervous system. It's why the smell of your ex's cologne can gut punch you before your conscious brain even registers what happened. Your nose basically has a VIP express lane to your feelings, and these circuits aren't some fancy human upgrade. Primary process affective systems, basically the genetically encoded wiring for fear, rage, play, and seeking, are conserved across mammals. The circuitry a rat uses to feel afraid overlaps meaningfully with yours. Same basic architecture, just different packaging. Your emotional brain is ancient, we're talking hundreds of millions of years old. You inherited it from ancestors who never had to worry about texting back too fast. So emotions aren't some fragile, uniquely human thing sitting politely in one brain region. They're fast, distributed, and evolutionarily old, which raises an obvious question. If the wiring is this deep and this ancient, what exactly is it doing? How you make meaning. Here's something that sounds like a self-help poster, but is actually backed by thousands of data points. Your emotions aren't reactions to what happens to you. They're reactions to how you interpret what happens to you. Your boss gives you extra work. You could interpret that as they're punishing me and feel angry. Or you could interpret it as they trust me with more responsibility and feel proud. Same event, completely different emotion. The difference is your appraisal, basically your brain's instant evaluation of what something means for you personally. That's called appraisal theory. And it's not just a nice idea. A meta-analysis across 309 studies and over 2,600 effect sizes found that 75% of predicted appraisal to emotion links were statistically significant, with an average effect size of R equals 0.33. That's not earth-shattering per individual link, but across thousands of tests, the pattern is overwhelming. Your interpretation is doing most of the emotional heavy lifting. So what happens if you deliberately change the interpretation? That's called reappraisal, and it's the single most studied emotion regulation strategy in psychology. When you reframe how you see a situation, your brain actually shifts gears. Amygdala activation goes down. Prefrontal and parietal control networks light up, the same regions involved in working memory, task switching, and inhibition. You're not suppressing the emotion, you're changing the input that generates it. But here's where it gets interesting. The brain regions that predict better emotional control, specifically the coupling between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and cerebellar areas called CRUs 1 and 2, are the same regions linked to higher self-esteem. In other words, how well you regulate your emotions is tied to how you see yourself. That's not a motivational quote, that's functional brain imaging. And when this system breaks down, the consequences aren't abstract. Research on executive function deficits found they indirectly increase hazardous alcohol use through poor emotion regulation, with a documented indirect effect of 0.097. Small number, real pathway. Poor cognitive control leads to poor emotional control, which leads to reaching for a bottle. It's a chain, and it starts with how well your brain manages meaning. So, your feelings are built on interpretations, and interpretations can be changed. But what happens when those feelings need to go somewhere? Built to survive. Let's talk about jealousy. You know, that ugly, stomach-churning feeling you get when someone flirts with your partner at a party. Most people treat jealousy like a character flaw, something to be ashamed of, something to work on in therapy, something that makes you a bad person. But here's the thing, it might be working exactly as intended. A lab experiment with 222 romantic partners found that when research researchers experimentally induced jealousy, participants became significantly more willing to perform mate retention behaviors. They got more attentive, more protective, more invested. Basically, jealousy made people try harder to keep their partner. That's not a bug. That's a feature. Evolution built jealousy to solve a specific adaptive problem, losing a reproductive partner to a competitor. You feel it because your ancestors who felt it kept their mates, had kids, and passed that wiring down to you. Congratulations. Your insecurity is millions of years old and functioning perfectly, and jealousy isn't special here. Emotions in general exist because they solved survival problems. Fear solved, don't get eaten. Disgust solved, don't eat that rotten thing. Anger solved, someone is threatening what's mine, and I need to do something about it right now. The neural hardware for anger in mammals runs a conserved route from the medial amygdala through specific hypothalamic nuclei to a region called the periaqueductal gray. That's basically the same threat defense pathway in you, a dog, and a rat. Evolution found a circuit that worked and copy-pasted it across species for millions of years. So if these emotional systems are that ancient and that conserved, the expressions should be universal too, right? That's what Paul Ekman argued. 6 basic emotions, 6 universal facial expressions recognized by every human on Earth regardless of culture. You probably learned this in Psych 101, and there's real evidence for it. Cross-cultural coding of over 2,600 facial and body displays across China, India, Japan, Korea, and the USA did find core universal patterns. So far, so good. Evolution clearly sets a template, but a study published in PNAS complicated the story. Researchers found that Eastern participants do not use the same sets of facial movements for the 6 classic basic emotions as Western participants. The expressions weren't identical across cultures, they were systematically different, so what Ekman framed as hardwired and universal turns out to be more culturally filtered than anyone in that Psych 101 class was told. Evolution gives you the emotional engine, but culture decides how it sounds when it revs. In other words, biology builds the foundation, culture remodels the house. Which raises a pretty big question: just how deep does that cultural remodeling actually go? Culture shapes the signal. Here's something that should bother you. Whether emotions are universal or not depends, in large part, on how you ask the question. Seriously. When researchers test whether people around the world recognize the same facial expressions, they usually do it with a forced choice task. You see a face, you get a list of 6 emotions, you pick one. And when you do it that way, people across cultures agree at pretty high rates. Western participants nail basic expressions about 78 to 83% of the time. Non-Western participants score a bit lower, somewhere around 63 to 76%, but still well above chance. Looks universal, right? But here's the problem. When you take away the list and just ask people, what emotion is this person feeling? With no options to choose from, agreement drops a lot. Free labeling tasks and field studies in small-scale societies consistently produce weaker cross-cultural matches. The multiple choice format was doing some of the heavy lifting. You weren't just measuring recognition, you were measuring the ability to match a face to a word when given a handful of options. That's a very different thing. So a chunk of the emotions or universal evidence is partly an artifact of the test design. That's not a minor footnote. That's a fundamental problem with how we build scientific knowledge about feelings. Okay, so if the old methods are shaky, what does better data actually show? A massive machine learning analysis scraped millions of videos from 144 countries and tracked which facial expressions showed up in which social contexts: weddings, funerals, protests, sports events. The result, facial expressions match their expected social context about 70% of the time worldwide. That's a real meaningful amount of cross-cultural overlap. But it also means 30% of the variation is culturally specific, not noise, not error. Genuine cultural differences in how people move their faces in emotional situations. Take anger. Across cultures, anger reliably functions as a signal that someone violated a norm. You cut in line, you break a promise, you eat the last slice without asking. That triggers anger basically everywhere. The function is universal, but the expression, that's where culture steps in. How intensely you show anger, whether you raise your voice or go silent, whether you confront someone publicly or wait until you're alone, all of that is regulated by cultural display rules. Same emotion, different performance. So the honest answer to are emotions universal is about 70% yes, 30% it depends on where you grew up. Not a clean binary, not a satisfying headline, but probably the closest thing to the truth we've got. Now, if culture shapes how emotions look on the outside, what happens when you try to build a theory of what emotions actually are on the inside, when emotions break down? So far, we've been talking about emotions like like they're this elegant, well-oiled system. Evolved circuits, cultural tuning, philosophical debates about construction versus hardwiring, all very tidy. But here's the thing about systems, they break. And when your emotional system breaks, you don't just feel bad, you get a clinical diagnosis. Let's start with how common this actually is. In a US adolescent sample, 15.2% met criteria for an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. 1.7% for major depressive disorder. And these are kids, not stressed out adults with mortgages and existential dread, kids. Before we even factor in global crises, the baseline rate of emotion-related conditions is already surprisingly high, and then a global crisis showed up anyway. In 2020, the incidence of new anxiety diagnoses was about 28.81 per 1,000 people. That's already a lot of anxiety. But in people who actually tested positive for COVID-19, that number jumped to 46.89 per 1,000. That's a 63% relative increase. Getting physically sick didn't just make people feel crummy for a week, it measurably increased the likelihood of developing an anxiety disorder. Viral illness and emotional disorder turned out to be way more entangled than most people assumed. Your immune system and your emotional system are not separate departments, they share a building, and apparently they share a ventilation system too. But here's where it gets really interesting from a clinical perspective. When researchers look across different psychiatric conditions, they keep finding the same thing underneath. Emotional dysregulation, not unique to one disorder, it shows up prominently in ADHD, borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, substance use issues, and more. It's what clinicians call a transdiagnostic factor, meaning it cuts across diagnostic categories. The implication is kind of profound. A huge range of mental health conditions might share a common emotional mechanism. So increasingly, therapists are treating the regulation deficit directly rather than just targeting the diagnostic label. Fix the engine, not just the warning light on the dashboard. And one finding makes this especially clear. Patients with eating disorders who struggle with emotional dysregulation score particularly high on something called the strategies subscale of the difficulties in emotion regulation scale. What that subscale measures is basically whether you have access to effective coping strategies when you're upset. The core problem isn't that these patients feel too much, it's that they run out of ways to cope with what they feel. They're not broken because their emotions are too big, they're stuck because their toolbox is too small. That reframe matters a lot because it shifts the conversation from something is wrong with how you feel to you need more tools for handling what you feel, which is more compassionate, more accurate, and frankly, more useful. So emotions can break down, but understanding how they break tells us something important about how they work in the first place and about what we might be able to build to fix them. What emotions actually are. Okay, so we've talked about what emotions do, where they show up in the brain, how culture shapes them, and what happens when they go sideways. But we've been dancing around a pretty fundamental question this whole time. What actually are emotions? Because depending on who you ask, you get two very different answers. The first answer is the one most people intuitively believe. Emotions are hardwired biological programs. Fear is fear, anger is anger. Each one has a dedicated circuit, a signature facial expression, and a universal fingerprint that's basically the same whether you're in Tokyo or Toronto. This is the basic emotion view, and it's been the dominant framework for decades. The second answer is weirder, and honestly kind of unsettling. It comes from Lisa Feldman Barrett and her theory of constructed emotion, and it says emotions are not fixed responses at all, they're predictions. Your brain takes a bunch of noisy signals from your body, heart rate, breathing, gut activity, blood sugar, all of it, and it doesn't wait around to figure out what those signals mean. It guesses. It takes your past experiences, your learned concepts about what anger or sadness feel like, and it constructs an emotion on the fly to explain what's happening inside you. So when you feel anxious before a presentation, your brain isn't detecting anxiety, it's predicting anxiety based on a racing heart, shallow breathing, and the fact that the last time you felt this way, you were also about to speak in front of people. The feeling comes after the prediction, not before. That's called constructed emotion. The engine behind this is something called allostasis. Most people know homeostasis, your body reacting to stay balanced. Allostasis is one step ahead of that. Your brain doesn't just react to your body's needs, it anticipates them. It's constantly running a simulation of what your body will need next and adjusting in advance. Emotions, in this model, are part of that prediction machinery. They're not a separate system bolted onto cognition, they are cognition. Your brain categorizing messy internal signals using whatever emotion concepts it's learned over a lifetime, which by the way, is a good time to kill a myth. You've probably seen the triune brain model. Reptilian brain at the bottom for survival instincts, mammalian limbic brain in the middle for emotions, rational neocortex on top for thinking. It's in textbooks, TED Talks, LinkedIn posts, everywhere. It's wrong. Modern neuroscience shows there's no clean layering like that. Cognition and emotion run through overlapping interdependent networks. The prefrontal cortex isn't sitting above your emotions judging them like a disappointed parent, it's tangled up in them. The amygdala isn't purely emotional either. either, it processes all kinds of information. The neat three-layer cake is a myth from the 1960s that refuses to die. Now here's why this debate actually matters beyond academia. If emotions are natural kinds, fixed biological categories, then psychiatric disorders are basically broken circuits. You find the broken part, you fix it. But if emotions are dynamic constructions that your brain builds from predictions and learned concepts, then disorders might be more like miscalibrated prediction systems. And the treatment looks completely different. You're not fixing a circuit, you're retraining a model. This isn't just philosophers arguing over definitions, it's a conflict over the fundamental nature of what you feel every single day. And right now, the field hasn't settled it, so what does the future look like when machines start trying to read these things? Machines learning to feel, so we've spent this entire video trying to understand emotions, and we're pretty good at it. Mostly. Sometimes. Okay, we're working on it. But here's a fun question. What if we taught computers to do it for us? That's the idea behind affective computing, a field pioneered by Rosalind Picard, who defined it as computing that relates to, arises from, or deliberately influences emotions. It sits at the intersection of computer science, engineering, psychology, and neuroscience, and it's growing fast. The pitch is simple. If machines can detect what you're feeling in real time, they can respond to you better. Your car notices you're drowsy, your therapist app notices you're spiraling, your phone notices you're angry and maybe doesn't show you Twitter. Sounds great, right? And the numbers look incredible. Deep learning models trained on speech can identify anger with about 92.3% precision and happiness with about 95.7%. Slap some EEG electrodes on someone's head and the models get even better, hitting 96.8% accuracy for valence and 96.9% for arousal on curated benchmark datasets. We're talking A+ grades across the board. Emotion recognition basically solved. Yeah, that was a lie. Those numbers come from perfectly controlled lab environments with clean data, consistent participants, and none of the chaos of actual human life. The moment you step outside the lab, everything falls apart. One study using federated learning for EEG emotion recognition hit 90.74% accuracy on benchmark dataset. Impressive. But when they tested individual clients in isolation, mimicking real-world conditions where data isn't pooled and standardized, accuracy collapsed to 29.31%. That's a 61 percentage point drop. That's not a crack in the system, that's the system shattering on contact with reality. And the most hyped technology in the world right now, large language models can do emotion recognition too, sort of. On zero-shot tasks where the model gets no specific training, LLMs achieve on weighted average recall roughly 15% above chance being about 14.3%. So they're better than a coin flip, congratulations. They still underperform fine-tuned models that were specifically built for the task. So when a headline says AI can read your emotions, what it really means is AI can guess your emotions slightly better than random in a controlled setting, and we wrote the headline before reading the methods section. But here's the thing, the real debate in affective computing isn't even about accuracy, it's about what happens when these systems get deployed anyway. If a company claims its software can detect employee disengagement through webcam footage, does it matter that the accuracy drops by 60 points outside the lab? If a government uses emotion recognition at border checkpoints, who's accountable when it's wrong? The questions aren't just technical, they're about privacy, consent, surveillance, and whether we're comfortable building systems that claim to know how we feel before we've decided ourselves. And honestly, that's a fitting place to end a video about emotions. We started with neural circuits firing in the brain, moved through psychology, evolution, culture, clinical breakdowns, and philosophical fights about whether emotions are even real categories. And now we're here, watching machines try to do what humans still can't fully explain. We've mapped the networks, named the theories, measured the chemicals, argued about the categories, and we still don't have a single definition everyone agrees on. Emotions are messy, personal and universal, and none of those things all at once. Every framework we've covered captures a piece of the truth, and none of them captures all of it. That's not a failure of science. That's just what happens when the thing you're studying is also the thing doing the studying. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.